25 years ago today, the Guildhall in Derry bore witness to one of the most remarkable and important theatrical events in the Irish theatre, the premiere of Brian Friel's Translations. At a time when the troubles in the north of Ireland seemed to have touched rock bottom, the Field Day Theatre Company, formed by actor Stephen Rea and playwright Brian Friel, sought to transcend the political stalemate and present a new, what they call, fifth province, providing and provoking debate on the political and social conditions within the north of Ireland. Later in the programme I'll be talking to Stephen Rea, and he'll be discussing the legacy of Field Day and also his recollections of that opening night of Translations in Derry 25 years ago. And in a few minutes I'll be joined by historian Professor Kevin Whelan to discuss the impact that Field Day Theatre Company had on the island of Ireland. But first, let's begin by listening to just a short sample of some of the emotive events that were taking place within Northern Ireland at around the time Translations was premiered in Derry.
No army here today.
No army.
Army? Where is it?
Army?
12,000 troops.
Where they are. Army? They're getting friggin' paid for nothing. That's what they're here for. They're getting paid for nothing. They want to get them back where they belong again.
We will accept the logic of our position, which is that there is no role that we can usefully play within the present system.
Against a background of shootings and bombings, the parade was banned and internment introduced on August the 9th.
As elected representatives, responding to the deeply felt wishes of the people we represent, we have worked out here at Sunningdale a settlement which, under God, could meet those needs and in addition provide a new basis for understanding in Anglo-Irish relations.
He placed a package on the counter and said, "Look, it's a bomb, you have 2 minutes to get out." So we simply evacuated the place.
And I was in the Abercorn cabaret upstairs and the bomb went off. I was standing at the bar and the corner of the building seemed to cave in towards us. Quite a lot of people were shocked.
The body came across the street here about, it must have been a second or so, but just before the blast.
Before you heard the blast?
Before I heard the blast, a second or so before the blast. Whether it was a passer-by or what, I couldn't say. And the next thing was, there's a whole stampede of children, women, men, screaming all over the place. The walls came tumbling down all around here.
And when I looked in, there was a green duffel bag lying just right at the leg of the coffee table, and the smoke was rolling out of it. And I closed the door again, and I screamed, "Bomb, bomb, bomb." And I shouted for everybody to run downstairs. And I saw the baby at the top of the stairs, and I made to go up for to get him. I'd got to about the third step of the stairs. I didn't hear an explosion. All I knew was that the whole thing had come in around me, and that I was in darkness. And I made my way through the rubble. I pulled myself through the rubble, and I got up the stairs, and I grabbled through it, and I got the child's hair, and I pulled him by the hair, and he cried. I knew he was alive.
Some late 70s aural images from Northern Ireland. As I said, I'm joined in studio by Professor Kevin Whelan, Director of the Keogh Centre of Notre Dame University here in Dublin. Kevin, tell me first of all about the late 70s and the early 80s in Northern Ireland. Set the scene for us and tell us the kind of things that were going on at around that time.
Well, I suppose both north and south on the island of Ireland in the late 70s, early 80s, when Field Day coagulated, situations were really grim. In the north, it just looked like there was absolutely no solution, that things were descending into a spiral of endless kind of violence, and that, northern society was reaching rock bottom. That was just kind of dropping into one of these endless Dantean circles where things were just getting worse day by day. And of course, this was the period of the hunger strikes. It was a period when violence seemed to have become endemic, and the kind of tit-for-tat nature of reprisal and further reprisal was on the go as well. And many people felt, and much of the intellectual discussion at the period would have been, that there was no solution to this thing, that we were kind of doomed to repetition, and that there was no way out of the northern problem, or even a way of imagining one's way out of it, because the two communities had locked themselves into this kind of mutual chamber of horrors. And of course, in the south, you had the oil crisis of 1973, which caused the closing down almost of so many of the multinational factories which had come in the 1960s and which had created a kind of a mood of optimism. And the Irish economy through the 1970s seemed to be going into a kind of a tailspin as well. The whole kind of revisionist controversy seemed to be poisoning kind of intellectual life. So, you know, by the late 70s, early 80s, it seemed that both North and South, we were, to use a Sean O'Casey phrase, kind of banjacks, and there was a real sense of terminal kind of paralysis in terms of how we might actually get out of this, how we might kind of reverse, as it were, the economic cycle in the south and the political cycle in the north.
And that was feeding into the cultural life north and south of the border as well.
Yes, it was, because the cultural life was equally, you know, polarised, and there was a horrible kind of tone of recrimination and kind of, you know, as if people were in the trenches and, you know, that were incapable of kind of seeing a way of behaving with kind of civility almost towards one another. And I think that was the moment when Field Day was founded, and was an effort to try to kind of maybe think a way out of that, to think beyond, for example, the binaries of English and Irish and Unionist and Nationalist, which I suppose in a way the use of the fifth province term gesture towards, that you needed some kind of imaginative space of reconciliation, some new way of imagining, some new way of thinking about what it meant to be Irish or indeed British. And of course the great play translations began that process, but those other plays as well, you know, ones like Kilroy's wonderful Double Cross and whatever, they were all engaged in trying to create a new imaginative space which would be sufficiently broad and capacious to kind of absorb, as it were, Irish people in a wider and more generous sense of what it might mean to be Irish, and also then to create maybe an intellectual and a political space for a new kind of debate, rethinking the kind of categories by which we'd kind of, as it were, lived our lives till then. So in one sense, you know, you could say that the Field Day process was the beginning of the peace process as well. There was the beginning of a way of kind of thinking out of the kind of cul-de-sacs, the sectarian and the political and economic cul-de-sac into which we'd kind of backed ourselves on this island in the 70s and early 80s.
In contested societies, and there's no doubt Northern Ireland was a contested society, everything is political. So was it realistic in Northern Ireland at that time to seek a cultural space above politics, to try and transcend politics? I mean, did Field Day not in effect become involved in politics, very much involved in politics, by identifying the northern problem as a colonial problem?
Well, you know, you have to have a mode of analysis, and in a sense I suppose what Field Day provided was a theatre of ideas, and ideas are by definition political, that you know, you cannot escape politics. And I suppose what Field Day did was to kind of say, look, the idea that somehow art or the aesthetic realm is a space beyond politics, that it's some kind of pure, uncontaminated private Idaho to which we can kind of retreat, and which will save us, as it were, from the horrors of the daily quotidian life that we're living in. It will save us from the bombs and the bullets, and if we can only retreat or advance or elevate ourselves into that pure aesthetic space, that somehow that will provide you know, a function, a moral and an ethical function for art. And you know, that's a very naive view. It's a political view itself, by the way, in terms of its retreat from it. Now, Field Day got a lot of criticism for, as it were, politicising the aesthetic space, but I think that was an absolutely necessary move to make. And of course what Field Day also did then was to kind of say, right, it's not just good enough to introduce this debate in terms of a kind of a theatre of ideas. What we also need to do is to develop, as it were, an intellectual understanding of how it was that we got ourselves into these situations, so that Field Day, you know, quite naturally and in some respects interestingly mutated from being as it were, a theatre company, pure and simple, into also being an intellectual and a cultural force. And again, in a sense, the political animus directed against Field Day came as much from the sense that it was inappropriate or exorbitant to make these kind of cultural or intellectual gestures, as it was from, as it were, the politics of the theatre itself.
But to what extent did they contribute to reconciliation in Northern Ireland, or to what extent did they only contribute to one pole, one side of a debate?
Well, as I say, I think all their plays and in some respects all their intellectual activities were an effort to kind of transcend the binary, to transcend this idea that somehow all you have is Irish and English, Protestant and Catholic, Unionist and Nationalist. And it was a kind of a way of trying to think outside that kind of box. And I think that they made a very successful effort to do that, and also to do something else, which was to kind of say that if you understand the Irish situation purely in, as it were, in terms of the specificities and peculiarities of Ireland itself, that's too narrow. So again, one of the things that we're able to do was to bring other people, and notably people like Edward Said and Fred Jemison, Terry Eagleton, into the debate as well, and to kind of say, look, we need a broader lens to look at this situation as well. And the most appropriate one from their point of view was obviously to kind of see it in some respects as belonging to a colonial and a post-colonial situation. And I think that, again, that's been something which has been very helpful. But it was always too kind of saying, look, there isn't one way just of thinking about this. And, Field Day involved obviously people like Tom Paulin and so on as well, but, who would have had a very different take on it. But it was always kind of saying, look, we have to kind of find new ways of thinking if we're going to kind of get out of the cul-de-sac.
So you don't see them as a movement which was attempting in any way to counter cultural or even historical revisionism and to restore nationalist mythology? I mean, I think Seamus Dean actually referred to revisionist historians as people who were demolishing the nationalist mythology. Was he not in some way trying to restore that?
No, I think the last thing that Field Day would have been was, or should be seen as, is nationalists. Whether you could say they were Republican is a different thing, but they would have certainly had a cosmopolitan view of what the situation was. That nationalism was something which was quite narrow and restrictive, and which kind of says ourselves alone, as it were. Now, Field Day were never promoters of that type of agenda. They were always saying what we need is something bigger, something larger, something more capacious. And in a sense, what they were saying was that nationalism is a kind of a narrow gauge view of what Ireland is. So I think, in a way, as I said, that they were kind of trying to step above that, but also to understand and, in a sense, demolish the categories of the debate, to kind of say that what we're trapped in is a set of stereotypes, and that if we want to understand how to kind of move out of that, it's no point inhabiting one or the other side of the binary. What we have to do is understand how we are mutually kind of implicated in it. And as I said, I think the intellectual effort that they expended on that was, in a sense, what created the political animus towards them. Because in Ireland, it has always been possible to make, as it were, the aesthetic gesture, to be a very good singer, or to be a very good writer, or a very good poet. But once you start saying, well, hold on, that's not enough. What we also have to understand is how this work is received, or what are the intellectual structures by which we understand it. In other words, to introduce, shall we say, criticism, that it has always been resisted, and it's a problem of small cultures. Small cultures usually find that their critical agenda, their intellectual agenda, is set for them by scholars from somewhere else. It's set in the metropolitan areas. And what Field Day were doing, especially I think once Seamus Dean got heavily involved, was to, in a sense, relocate the centre of gravity of intellectual understanding of Irish society from London, from New York, back into Ireland. And maybe what also gave offence was that they did it from, as it were, a spiritual home in Derry rather than in Dublin. But kind of saying, look, it's not just good enough that we are these great writers, poets, musicians and whatever. What we also have to do is understand for ourselves what it is that's valuable, what it is that we need to discard, what it is that we need to expand in the culture. And that fed into, of course, the Field Day anthology, but also into the critical endeavours of Field Day. So from the beginning, Field Day was a theatre of ideas, but it also had a very significant intellectual component. And I think you have to understand those two kind of twin tracks. And it's not just good enough, as many theatre people would say, sometimes to kind of say, oh, well, I really like the kind of plays, but they took a wrong turn once they started into publishing.
Kevin, to most people it was about plays. It wasn't necessarily about an intellectual debate. Who were the people, who were the audiences, who actually went to see Field Day productions?
Well, Field Day from the beginning too had a touring policy, so they went to lots of the small towns north and south across the island, which of course was a model that was later adopted very successfully by Druid. And there is a sense in which Field Day was a national theatre in the 1980s, and it was described as such by Michael Billington, the distinguished theatre critic of the Guardian. But they also reached out to a non-theatrical audience, in a sense too, by appearing in non-theatrical spaces. They began in the Guildhall in Derry, which wasn't a theatre, and that I think created a space and an opening for many ordinary people to kind of come to them. And I think if you looked at the composition of the early field day audiences, that they were a non-standard theatre audience, and for many people the field day plays would have been the first time that they'd seen these kind of dramas. And field day was consciously, through its touring policy, through appearing in non-traditional venues, was consciously trying to reach and create and mobilise a new audience for theatre in Ireland.
Professor Kevin Whelan, thank you very much indeed.